We'll get started. So welcome everybody for this excellent moderated grand rounds for emergency medicine on COVID and the economy and how it affects patients and providers. So COVID-19 has affected all of us in many ways, clinically, even right now, the burden of cases and the PPE and the stress of diagnostic testing, academically for many of us, innovation to teach, do trials, treat patients, and make grants with females and minorities more than others. And our home life, as we're now all school teachers, babysitters, nursing homes, adapting to limit our risk and figure out how to send kids to college and facing social isolation. Now, many of the folks who've lost their jobs and lost their families from COVID, I think we're seeing those effects now in our colleagues and healthcare workers as COVID drags on. And that's what brings us together today. Dr. Libby, an economist, to share the economic implications of the households and policy change, and Dr. Zane, a national leader in healthcare industry, to share the market dynamics and the employment outlook for healthcare. For this grand round, it's going to be moderated by Dr. Betts. She's our senior scientist moderator. She's an associate professor of emergency medicine at CU Anschutz and my office neighbor at AO1. She's a clinical and translational researcher focused on development and implementation of patient-centered interventions to prevent injuries and funded by NIH, VA, and DoD and several foundations. She's also a research physician for the VA in their geriatric research program, the GREC, and a deputy director of the Piper program at the School of Public Health that focuses on injury prevention and research. And she's a national leader in education and messaging around sensitive public health issues like suicide, firearms, and COVID. And Dr. Betts, take it over from here.
Thank you, Dr. Babarda. It's my pleasure to be able to moderate this panel today. And I have to say that, economics and health policy is not an area that I work in my own academic work, but certainly as a parent, as a practicing emergency physician, as an academician, as someone with family members spread out around the country, this is something I've been living and feeling with everyone else as well. And I'm really looking forward to our presentations today. So first, a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and we'll distribute the link afterwards. Second, we'll have a time for Q&A at the end. So please put any questions, preferably into the Q&A box at the bottom or the chat box if you have trouble seeing that. And we'll be going through those later. So please do put things in. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers. So first, Dr. Ann Libby is professor and vice chair for academic affairs in the Department of Emergency Medicine. She has a national reputation for patient-oriented outcomes research, studying the organization and financing of healthcare systems, particularly focused on behavioral health and underserved populations. Her academic training includes a PhD in economics and a postdoctoral fellowship in health economics and policy. Dr. Libby is an expert on mentored research and faculty development, and she co-leads multiple programs funded by federal and philanthropic sources. Today, she will start us off speaking on economic cycles and their implications for households, markets, and policy responses. After Dr. Libby, we'll move to Dr. Richard Zane, who is professor and the George Bodeker and Bodeker Foundation endowed chair of emergency medicine and my direct boss. So hopefully the outlook for employment looks good. Dr. Zane serves as the Chief Innovation Officer and Executive Director for Emergency Services at UC Health, and he founded the UC Health Care Innovation Center. He's a national expert and leader in emergency care administration, clinical operations, healthcare quality, and digital health innovation. And in an innovative fashion today, he will be speaking without PowerPoint slides, so please don't be shocked if they don't show up on your monitor. He'll be talking about healthcare market dynamics and the employment outlook for healthcare workers, really taking it from a macro level, and then down to what it means for those of us on the front lines right now. So first, I will turn it over to Dr. Libby. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Betts. Hello, colleagues and guests. We're so pleased to address you today because the pandemic recession is affecting us all. So I will share with you my 5 objectives for our time together. First, we're going to talk about some of the basics of the economic features that are unique in many ways to this pandemic recession. There are some ways that it's similar to others and quite different. We'll talk about healthcare markets and how we're being impacted by the recession and how health markets influence the economy. We will address federal, state, and local policies that are used as remedies in cases of downturn, like now. Specifically, we're going to address some of the distributional issues, who experiences relatively more hardship or more safety, so to speak, in this current recession. And then finally, we will address some very specific issues about our current and our future provider. So if you're a resident or trainee, some things that you in particular could think about. And in addition to what are probably obvious challenges on this subject, I have made very clear, I hope you agree, that there are definitely bright spots. So it's not all gloom and doom. Despite economics being known as the dismal science, I do have some encouragement for you. All right, I'm assuming that your basic knowledge of economics maybe is at the level of an introductory economics class sometime in your past. You might remember it well, or you might have forgotten it all. Maybe you know a lot more than that, but we're not going to start at the very, very beginning of how markets form and what is money, but we're going to begin by talking about what is a business cycle. So that's the economic pattern that it characterizes a recession. So we'll begin with the leading indicator, the sole dependent variable that is used to measure a recession, and that is the gross domestic product, or GDP. And I have a reduced form equation here on the first line. GDP is a sum of these very specific components: consumption, investment, government spending, net taxes, and net exports. So exports minus imports, and that's referred to as the trade deficit. Now, consumption is by far the largest component of GDP. It has the largest multiplier effect. So swings in consumption in the economy have large and amplifying effects on the outcome of the economy, GDP. GDP is the heat, the account that measures all activity from buyers and sellers and income. So it covers demand for all goods and services. And it's a measure relative to productive capacity. So what is happening in goods and services in the economy now relative to what it could be given capacity. Consumption here, I've written it out for you because it is so critically important. So you see, these are the major components of consumption as measured in GDP: food, clothing, housing, energy, health, and transportation. I thought it was interesting to share that in 1901, so over 100 years ago, but at the beginning of the 20th century, the average household income in the US was $750. And at that time, 80% of a family's budget went to food. And the 20% went to housing and all these other things. So 80-20, the 80-20 rule is a strange rule of thumb that crops up in many things. It happens in consumption as well. Now today, the most recent number is the average household income in the US is just over $50,000. And actually those shares are reversed. So in today's economy, roughly 80% of a household income goes to housing and 20% goes to those other things. Now, how do we define a recession? So a recession is defined based on GDP alone. And there is a business cycle dating committee at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they are the arbiter of business cycle dating. And a recession is simply 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth of GDP. That's what it takes to be a recession. It can last longer, but that's the minimum distance. Now, on this chart that is up, this is jobless rates. And as you see, there are a couple, well, there's 3 of the largest peaks. So the largest is the Depression, the Great Depression, really triggered by the stock market crash of 1929. You might be interested to know or to be reminded that measured unemployment in the US during the Great Depression was over 20%. So 1 in 5 people were looking for work and couldn't get work. And that lasted for 6 years. 6 years. In the Great Recession, so that was the recession dated December 2007 to June 2009, unemployment was 4%, well, up to 8%. But it only lasted a couple of years only. It was quite severe. Now, in April of this year, 2020, really shortly after COVID really hit hard, employment fell in the US by 20 million jobs. So that's the spike that you see here on this graph. All right, now many of us have heard that the COVID recession ended what is measured as the longest economic expansion on record in the US. And that is true, as you see, based on NBER business cycle dating, there were 128 quarters of continuous positive growth, or not more than 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So when COVID hit, that was the end of the party. Now, during that last economic growth period, as you see, 2009, that's the end of the Great Recession, growth was actually quite modest in that period. So yes, it was positive, and yes, it was growing, and yet growth was modest, just over 2%, not enough to cause inflation. And importantly, 2 things that we as workers in the economy would care about is that job growth was quite modest and earning gains were modest. So it didn't change people's standard of living in large ways, in contrast to some of the earlier post-war expansionary periods. Now, I had mentioned the pandemic recession is the same as, and yet quite different from other recessions. The pandemic is extremely different in this important way. This pandemic has a large and disproportionate impact on women in this economy. And here's why. Regular recessions, or typical past US recessions, have hit male-dominated sectors the hardest. So if you think of the Great Recession, it was caused by a financial bubble bursting, right? There was a crisis in the financial sector. So lending, financial services, and financing of construction. So those are typically male-dominated. In contrast, the pandemic recession immediately hit businesses where there are services provided, where there is not social distancing. So the number 1 sectors are the service sectors: restaurants, hospitality, travel. So I have a statistic here for you. 74% of women are employed in high contact service industries, high contact occupations. So when the pandemic causes immediate social distancing guidance, like safe at home, safer at home, it immediately hits the sectors where a large majority of the workers are women. The second impact is in childcare. Many of us have experienced, whether personally or with friends and loved ones, daycares closing and schools closing. Nearly a third of the US workforce has a child under the age of 14. And 2/3 of those don't have a stay-at-home parent. So many of these families are, as Dr. Barbarda described, now also homeschooling, trying to care for children while attending to work. And 30% of all households with children have all children under the age of 6. So families have really been hit hard. This is a pretty illustrative figure. This is the difference between measured unemployment between women and men. And it's in this post-war period to now. And the blue bars mean that men's unemployment exceeds women's unemployment. So you can see in the Great Depression and in the Great Recession, very clearly the sectors that were heavily influenced were mostly employing males. And as you see, that is quite the opposite. And in this way, this pandemic recession is unique in the entire history of the US economic experience of business cycles. Now, that last chart showed measured unemployment. What is also quite critical, and we're seeing more and more, are 2 unmeasured variables. Well, maybe 3 unmeasured variables. One is that you might still be measured as employed, but there are studies of changes in work hours that have demonstrated that women with young children have reduced their labor supply, so they cut back their hours by 4 to 5 times the same rate as men. So they're cutting back hours, presumably getting paid less. And then importantly, they're dropping out of the labor force. So to be in the measured unemployment, you have to be seeking work, not employed and seeking work. So there are some very specific characteristics you have to join that denominator. And if you leave the workforce because perhaps you have a household decision to make, just assume you have a husband and wife with children. The wife perhaps makes less money because we know there's a persistent wage gap, or might be working in lower paid industries anyway. And somebody's got to step back to attend to these children. It's probably going to be a household decision. It's commonly the woman. So you see the darker blue bars at the top of this chart are the labor force participation rate of men, and the employment to population ratio, which shows of all working age people of that gender, what proportion are employed. And as you see, there's quite a gap. And just, the data end in 2020, but the implication is that these numbers are going up. So women are coming out of the denominator for measured unemployment and dropping out. Now, what does this mean overall? This is a chart of income gains over time in the US, again, post-World War II period. And as you see, real standards of real income, so income adjusted for inflation, and incidentally standards of living have been going up very strongly in this post-war period. And you see in the 80s, income equality start to grow. So the red line, the top line, is the top percentile of income. And then there's the midpoint, and then there's the median. And you can see this basically means the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that's increasing in rate in this current pandemic. Now, that is foreshadowing for me to show you a couple of graphs. They're a little bit busy, but they illustrate the distributional burden of this recession. Everybody's not being hit equally hard. So the loss leaders, these are bars that show percent change in jobs. So they're negative bars, meaning there's unemployment. The industries that have low paying workers are being hit the hardest. And the industries that pay the most are hit the least. And on the right panel, those bars reflect the workers' level of education, maximum education. So you see, if you have less than high school or high school education, these types of workers are experiencing much higher rates of unemployment. Likewise, if you look at estimates of hardship, looking at people who are behind on their rent, this chart shows some variation by race, ethnicity. You can see overall, 1 in 5 families who are renters are saying that they're struggling with making ends meet. And this was in July when there was some unemployment insurance. So certainly it's worse now. And many of those families are in households with children. So again, it's hitting pretty hard where people live. And especially for those people who are less educated, have young families, and many who have somebody who's cutting back on work hours or dropping out of the labor market to attend to children who aren't in school. Now, those kinds of characteristics are often called Main Street. So it's where we live, how we feel, what are we experiencing as workers or neighbors. The contrast is Wall Street. So that's the stock market. And indeed, Wall Street is one of the bright spots of what is happening right now. So just like GDP is a leading indicator of the economy and economic cycles, the S&P 500 index is a benchmark index for our stocks. And it is at the heart of most of our investments, our people's investments, like your retirement fund, for example, your 401k accounts. And the stock market dropped quite a bit right in the first month of the recession. And it's already rallied back. As of this morning, it was at 34.34. It reflects future expectations. So the GDP reflects current spending, and it can be quite dismal. Perhaps now we might call it some dismal. Well, the stock market is rallying because there are expectations that things are going to be better in the future. Now, the stock market today in 2020 is heavily dominated by the big 5 tech companies. So that's Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google's parent company. And that's what's been driving the growth in the stock market to date. Now, if anybody's been interested in buying a house, you might think, oh, there's a recession. Maybe now I can afford that house I wanted. In fact, the housing market is going gangbusters as well. Denver median home sale price crested 500,000 for the first time in July. That was driven up by one extremely expensive home. There was a house sold in Denver for $24 million. Nevertheless, it's very high by any market measure, and gas prices are low. So those are some of the silver linings. Now, let me explain to you why Wall Street is booming. It's because, in large part, because of monetary policy. So I'll just remind you, monetary policy is one of the major levers for our country, our governing bodies, to help fight recession and unemployment and inflation. And when we talk about monetary policy, I mean the Federal Reserve System, so also called the Fed, and that is our central bank. And it uses money supply to stabilize prices and fights inflation, and it is one of their goals to target interest rates. So generally speaking, we have experienced downturns in the past when the Fed raises interest rates to cool everybody's jets. So the economy is heating up. They will target a higher interest rate, which makes it more expensive to get credit, and therefore it slows down economic activity. In this current market for the post-war expansion, the Fed has had interest rates hovering around its target of 2%, and the federal funds rate, which is what it charges other banks to get money, has been near zero. So the Fed is they say, lending, not spending. Their main goal is to make credit smooth and easy and to target interest rates and inflation. So when the Fed has driven down interest rates so super low, it makes money free to us, or cheap. Money is cheap. That's why the housing markets rally, because everybody can get credit to buy a house. And in the same way, when those interest rates are very low on treasury bills or bonds or the safer government issued securities, well, nobody wants to put their money in those investments because they're not paying well. So guess what? Everybody dumps their investments back into the stock market, which drives stock market rallies. So monetary policy has been at work really since the Great Recession. It's as low as it can go. There are some things they can do once they've hit their threshold called quantitative easing. They can start buying actual private equities, which has its own issues, because then the government, the Fed, is competing against private investors. But the point is, in large part because of monetary policy, that's why the stock market is booming, and that's why the housing market is so strong. Now, the other major type of policy that's used to attenuate recessions is called fiscal policy. And the tagline for fiscal policy is tax and spend. And the idea is, we talked about business cycles, right? You go up and down, and the dips are the recessions. Fiscal policy is designed to be counter-cyclical. So when the economy goes down, when GDP and income is low, government spending kicks in to pull us to heat up that GDP, to infuse money into the economy, to help people get started on private investments and activities that will carry the day. So two of the biggest and most important counter-cyclical fiscal policies in this recession and in others are unemployment insurance and food assistance, right? When a recession comes, they start giving out funds. The most common example that people think about in terms of counter-cyclical policies are the FDR New Deal and the WPA infrastructure programs. So that was to help people in the Great Depression. They allocated, their goal was one job per household. And they just needed to help people get back to work. Remember, that lasted for 6 years. And so that carried the day, really, until World War II started, and all those people were in demand for wartime efforts. Now, tax relief can come in a way that's different from just giving money. So some opportunities for tax relief can be federal policies giving flexibility to spend money in different ways, more creative ways. And sometimes fiscal policies are combinations of state and federal. So it can be dollars, or it can be letting you use your dollars more effectively and efficiently. Now, in Colorado, we have the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is a safeguard against debt for our state. However, what that does is it prevents counter-cyclical policy remedies at the state level. So when there is a recession, the Colorado government cannot spend more than they have, frankly. Now, I mentioned unemployment insurance. Just in the first quarter of the recession, 31 million people in the United States filed for unemployment insurance. Now, unemployment insurance is a federal and state program. It's a combo program, and it gives cash benefits to eligible workers. So this is, you get some kind of unemployment insurance, you get money, and you have to be eligible. And the benefit, it's an insurance, a type of insurance, so you get a benefit. Your benefit is based on what you made in the prior year, and you have to qualify, and you have to do certain things over time. So, for example, each state has their own program. There are some slight differences, but you have to be able and available to work. You have to enroll in job seeking programs. If you get a job offer and you don't take it, you have to report it. So there's lots of things you have to do to participate in unemployment insurance. The maximum benefit is usually 26 weeks, so about 6 months. And then there's a federal extended benefit, which is 13 weeks. So basically, if you are on unemployment insurance for 9 months, you are considered long-term uninsured. Now, there are two specific counter-cyclical policies that came out right at the beginning of the pandemic recession. One is this emergency fund, and that's because gig workers, contractors, self-employed people, generally speaking, would not meet eligibility to participate in unemployment insurance. So this special feature helped that group get access to unemployment insurance. The other unique feature was the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. Those were loans to be forgiven in general to businesses. That was a flat fund. So that was $350 billion. And those funds were depleted in 13 days. 13 days. So they've authorized an additional amount of $3 billion. So that was unemployment insurance, and then the special feature to businesses. Now, let's return to healthcare. One of the most significant consequences for being unemployed in this country is that workers lose access to employer-based health insurance. And most Americans, 75%, access health insurance through their employer. So the balance are on federal programs like veterans benefits, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, so we have more than 20 million Americans who are facing a loss of health insurance. So you have a few options, well, two options and maybe a third. The first main option is through the Consolidated Omnibus Reconciliation Act, COBRA. You can continue to purchase your employer, the health insurance that had been provided to you through your employer. Under Obamacare, you can enter the marketplace exchange and buy into a subsidized health insurance program. Or if you become very poor, some proportion of income relative to poverty, you may be able to buy into Medicaid if your state has an expansion program. Now, I'm going to show you this picture of this lovely car. This car costs just over $20,000 a year. It's $21,000 a year. And that is the same cost as it would take a family to pay for a COBRA premium every year. So to be unemployed and to maintain health insurance coverage, it's as if you're asking families who may have quite extreme cuts in their income to buy a new car every year. and they don't get the card. All right, now what does this mean for the healthcare market, for us as part of this health system? This means that we have a huge shift of people who had been on commercial health insurance now possibly buying into public insurance. So if they're lucky, they're in the 39 states that have Medicaid expansion, which makes Medicaid open to not only children, but to adults. They are not as generous as commercial insurance. And in the Great Recession, we saw a 14% increase in enrollment in Medicaid. So this, there's also some discussion, although it's not allowed right now, about maybe making a Medicare buy-in. So Medicare is the federal health insurance program for people over 65. There's talking about, maybe making it Medicare for all, or Medicare for people 55 and up. That's not possible now. But the point is, if there is a fluctuation into public health insurance, it will greatly compromise the financial picture for health systems who rely on that for revenue. Now, that doesn't change the fact that healthcare is a huge part of GDP. In fact, it's 20% of GDP. And healthcare as a proportion of GDP has doubled in the last 30 years. And that's explained by better technology, higher costs, and also aging demographics. So you might be interested to know that health insurance is one of the largest components of consumer spending. Remember, we talked about consumption. It's 88% of consumption, so quite a large portion. Also, health insurance is the largest component of non-wage compensation, 26% on average. So it is quite significant. Now, healthcare led job growth coming out of the Great Recession. So 11% of the US workforce works in healthcare markets. So when you look at this graph and you say, oh my gosh, health expenditures are 30% of GDP, is that too much? Do we need more healthcare? Are we going to ultimately only be in a healthcare economy? You might ask yourself, would you rather have 1987 medicine at 1987 prices or 2020 medicine at 2020 prices? So that reflects, probably you would say you'd rather have modern medicine. That reflects a quality increase, price adjusted. Okay, now I promised more bright side. So if you are a current or future, especially a future provider, you're a trainee, a resident, fellow, doctoral student, I want to remind you of a few things, which is not to give you financial advice. And yet, education is almost always the best investment you can make because it almost uniformly increases your income. And the more specialized your education, the higher return to education. So the median physician income in the US is just under $200,000, which is well above the 90th percentile of all income in the US, which happens to be 126,900. So, it's good. You can feel good about your investment. Now, you are investing, you're spending money, you probably have school debt. We see residents graduating with large amounts of debt. So again, a bright spot, money is extremely cheap. So you can refinance and manage your debt better than any time in history. So you can feel good about your investment and about the tools you have to manage that debt. It's a good investment. Now, standards of living are higher than ever in our history. So you should absolutely be thinking about building cash reserves and building wealth. And then finally, the stock market is strong. it will likely remain strong. And the most powerful thing you can do, the most powerful, is to put your money in a money market account and let it sit. So you need time on your side. So I want to really encourage you, wherever you work, you absolutely have to participate in your retirement plans and really sock money away in investment funds as early as possible, because time will have a significant impact on your wealth in the future. Okay, so to wrap it up and turn it over to Dr. Zane, so far in this pandemic, the actions we've seen in federal fiscal and monetary policy have been considered life support. We have not yet seen true stimulus spending. So we're not experiencing a boom, and we're not experiencing a stimulus package. As we worry about how will the federal government create stimulus, I just want to remind you that in the federal budget, in the discretionary account, is where things we care for live. So higher education and science spending, the National Institutes of Health, are in the federal discretionary accounts. Healthcare is going strong. Many people consider healthcare a recession-proof business. And so despite challenges, I think Dr. Zane will talk about some more challenges, that we've seen some vulnerabilities, and yet it is absolutely essential work. And so I leave you with just a reminder that many of the patients and families we see are facing the hardships I've described. And so we want to absolutely emphasize bill transparency and connect people to services. And then finally, of course, we all have an opportunity to vote and to advocate for policy remedies that we think will help. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Dr. Zane.
Well, thank you, Dr. Libby. That was remarkable. I just want to tell everybody that about 2 or 3 years ago, I was asked to give a talk, and I said, I'm not going to use slides. And since then, I have not been using slides, and I think it's really a privilege. A year and a half ago, when I was allowed to fly on planes, I was flying to give a talk, and they absolutely insisted that I submit my slides before I go. So I did submit my slides before I went, and they were a series of random pictures that I had downloaded off the internet. So I've started using random pictures just to key in what it is that I'm thinking about and what it is that is probably important, topically related. So since I can't just show you random pictures, I can randomly change backgrounds. So the bottom line message is we're going to be fine. There's a lot that's going to happen, and I'm going to try and talk about where we are. But there's one really important thing that you can do to really guide our future. I'm not sure what that is. It might be behind me, but I think you get the picture. So I want to take you back a few hundred years. Dr. Libby did a very macro look, and I'm going to go really macro and bring you down micro, and hopefully do that in the next 8 to 10 minutes, and then answer the question that I think all the residents are thinking, and hopefully not the faculty, but many of the faculty, is, am I going to have a job? The short answer is yes, but here's the long answer. The 1800s is when we entered the healthcare financing system that we're in now. And it may seem odd, but when you go to a hospital or a doctor, you get a professional bill from the doctor, and you get a facility bill from the hospital if you need a hospital. And there's mixing of those two things. That's because in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when you had a need for healthcare, if you had resources, a healthcare provider came to you and you would pay them. If you did not have resources, you were brought to the poorhouse, and that was paid for by donations. And that's really the ideology of why we have facility and professional billing. That's it. But that's really defined how we function in healthcare, except for a few exceptions. One is Medicare. So Medicare, and that's been all over the last primaries. Medicare was started in 1965, which was the first organized healthcare coverage, universal healthcare coverage in the United States, except for federal prisoners and members of the military. And in 1965, it was thought that there were citizens who could not have planned to live so long that they would have to provide healthcare, because healthcare was provided almost exclusively as a benefit of employment. And in 1965, when Medicare began and the enrollment age was 65, the lifespan was 66.7 years. Since then, we've evolved a lot, whether we have Medicare or Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act, but the vast majority of people until recently were covered by private insurance, and most of that private insurance was provided through employment. Very different than almost any other modern country on earth, as everybody knows. So that brings us to, how do we work? How do we get employed? What drives our ability to be employed? As Dr. Libby mentioned, 11% of all jobs in the United States are tied to healthcare. 20% of the GDP goes to healthcare. And when you find yourself being employed or working as a physician, there are a number of different modalities. One is old-fashioned American private practice, where you hang a shingle and you see patients and you bill those patients directly or their insurance company. In emergency medicine, and that's where I'm gonna bring this, that private practice used to be a group of physicians who would contract with a hospital to provide emergency services. And that happened in two different ways. Either one or two senior people would hold that contract and employ the other physicians, or they would be democratic and share that contract and be partners in essentially a private practice where they bill patients who sought emergency services, and then they'd split all of those proceeds. Those single hospital, single group practices are incredibly rare. And I think as of last year, there were 21 of them left in the United States, and that's 4,000 hospitals. The other method of employment for emergency medicine is to be an employee of usually a hospital. Denver Health employs physicians, Kaiser employs physicians, and then very large multi-specialty practices employ physicians, and then academic centers employ physicians in various and sundry ways. A new entrant into healthcare and healthcare employment, which has really been a market differentiator, not good or bad, has been private equity. And for those of you who don't know what private equity is or venture capital is, it's essentially where a group of banks or a group of wealthy individuals or pension funds will purchase an entity and grow that entity in part and then sell it for something more. It was really common in things like supermarkets, where all these independent supermarkets would be bought by one large company, and that one large company would do things like back office work that would then cost less. Supplies would cost less because they'd have economies of scale to negotiate with the dairy, to negotiate with the farmer, et cetera. Then that happened in industry: gasoline, gas and oil, communications, tech, and it became really, really common. Healthcare was pretty late. You've seen a lot of healthcare systems form. Most of them were not formed in this private equity way, with the intention of bringing groups together and then selling them to another group or taking them public on Wall Street, although HCA is one big exception. What happened probably 7 or 8 years ago is that private equity started coming into physician practices. There's a lot of reasons for that. Mainly, physician practices are a consistent source of cash and income. And when you bring physician practices together across large geographic areas, you have economies of scale of negotiating with insurance companies for better rates. And that was all well and good. And what has happened in the last year has been pretty dramatic on the private equity physician practice market. Initially, it was usually urologists, gastroenterologists, orthopedic surgeons who were most susceptible to selling their practices to private equity. And the way it would work is there'd be a group practice, maybe 10 or 12 physicians. The senior partners in that group would take an enormous payout from private equity. The junior partners wouldn't do as well. And then they would work for X number of years. The private equity group would then bring in back office personnel, centralized revenue cycle, centralized contracting, bring the expenses down, and then bring the revenues up. And over the course, and this is a programmatic number, of 4 to 7 years, they would optimize that business and then exit that business. And the exiting of the business would be selling it to some bigger company or bringing it to Wall Street, usually to some bigger company. The way that these practices are valued are called multiples of EBITDA. And EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, amortization. And you would say if you had an EBITDA of 10, you would sell a practice for a multiple of 3 to 5. So you would 30 to 50. And it could be dollars or millions of dollars. What then began happening is the federal government looked at how this exit was happening, and they would regulate it depending on who was buying the practice. So as you know, there are lots of healthcare systems that have brought groups in and purchased practices. And there has to be a fair market valuation of that practice. And it's usually somewhere around 3 to 5 times earnings. But then very large companies, not healthcare providers, but tangentially related, like Optum, even though it seems like they should be very related or tangentially related, and DaVita, Fresenius would come in and buy these practices, and they could pay 10 times EBITDA. So this became almost gasoline on a fire, and there was a huge jump in private equity purchases of practices. And in the last 3 years, 3 to 5, there's been a huge number of emergency physician practices, anesthesiologists, pathologists, hospital-based specialties, where these practices have been purchased. And emergency medicine is particularly amenable to this because it's largely commoditized. There were a lot of groups where the senior partners were looking to get out, and these practices were purchased. In Colorado, USACS, or US Acute Care Solutions, a new entrant into the venture-backed physician purchasing groups came in, and they're national, and they probably spent $1.5 billion bringing physician practices together. But that was 3 to 5 years ago. And if you remember, that magic number of 3 to 5 to 7 years is when these investors are looking to get out of their investment. And they're looking to get out of their investment at almost a 3 to 5 times what they put into the investment. So what you've seen in emergency medicine combined with the pandemic has been an optimization of EBITDA because of the plan to exit. And usually when you optimize EBITDA, you have to decrease expenses. Physician salaries are one of the expense. And if you let physicians go, then all of a sudden your EBITDA goes higher. Now, what's happened across the country from the pandemic is that emergency department volumes were down pretty substantially, 40%. And that was true across almost everything that healthcare did. And no one really realized that there was that level of capacity in the market to decrease that much and so precipitously. What we've seen is a partial recovery across most of the domains of healthcare to about 90%. Now, 90% is completely sustainable in most every situation. Most private practice, most employed practices, most academic practices, but in private equity, 10% is an enormous number, especially when you're within 6 months or 2 years of when you wanted to exit that investment. So that was the question that I've been asked over and over again over the last 3 months, 5 months, is what is happening locally and what is happening nationally in emergency medicine. So what's happening is this entrant in private equity into emergency medicine, this and more amortization across multiple practices, and looking to have that match between jobs and people looking for jobs. So the short answer is I think we're all going to be fine as long as you vote properly. That's not true. I didn't say that. And I don't represent CU or the dean or the School of Medicine or the chancellor. That was me saying that. But there will be a lot of ebbs and flows over the next year. So the bottom line is we are going to recover from a healthcare perspective. Emergency medicine has recovered and is recovering even stronger. It'll be an interesting year, and interesting can be good, but you're going to be fine. So thank you, Dr. Libby. Thank you, Dr. Betts. Happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you both. We have a couple minutes for questions, and if it's okay with our two speakers, we might stay a little bit long if we can for audience members who can stay. So I'm going to take moderator privilege and throw a question in first for Dr. Zane. In Colorado, I think we've been fairly fortunate in terms of flattening our curve, and certainly have had to do a lot of preparing for a big COVID surge, but haven't necessarily seen that. Can you comment on the sort of economic implications for hospitals who have seen those huge increases in patient or purchasing PPE and so forth? Like, has the treatment of COVID itself significantly affected our care, or is much of that still being reimbursed under sort of traditional mechanisms?
So the short answer is, when we were at the peak, hospitals saw significant decreases in revenue, which I think everybody knows. Since the peak has gone down in the nadir, all of the hospitals in Colorado have been continuously working on things like PPE testing and planning for COVID admissions. Where we are now is, I think as everybody knows, the prevalence, meaning the test positivity rate, has gone up. And I think our test positivity was 8% yesterday. And our antibody positivity is 11% yesterday, which is triple what it was a while ago. But the number of hospitalizations, although increased, has not increased so precipitously. What has happened, though, is that the length of stay of patients who are COVID positive has increased substantially. And that's unclear why that has happened, but it appears as though not as many people are dying, and that's great. And we're sending a lot more people home, and that's good too. So I think the sweet spot of the people who are being admitted are the just staying longer because they're not going home and obviously not dying. Not sure if I answered the question, but that's where we are.
No, I think so. Thank you. Next question for Dr. Libby. You started with some really interesting statistics around unemployment during the Depression. Are there any estimates around what unemployment for healthcare, the healthcare industry, such as it was, was there a significant impact on healthcare employment? Does that make sense, in the Depression, since it wasn't a pandemic?
Yes, I saw that question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure there are within sector employment estimates from the period of the Great Depression, but I'll look. I'm curious now to look. But as you saw on that chart over, well, it started in 1948, showing GDP, healthcare as a sector growing as part of GDP. In 1948, it was just 10% of GDP. So if you might extrapolate at the same rate, you would imagine that the healthcare sector was a quite small portion of GDP in 1929. So logically, then the proportion of people in the US employed or subsequently unemployed, I think would have to be quite small. But I don't know the exact number.
Thanks. I also wanted us to touch briefly on the issues around differentials in how pandemic and sort of economic impacts on especially women and other specific communities. You know, I think this department in particular has been doing a lot of work over the years in trying to get to gender equity and pay and advancement and so forth. And I think, Dr. Libby, your presentation was really interesting in pointing out how this isn't just that women, for whatever reason, are being forced to or choose to stay at home, but it's also the industries that they work in, separate from healthcare, are the ones being affected. I'm curious if you have thoughts on how a state or the federal government can try to counteract that, whether through policies or taxes and so forth.
Yes, thank you. You know, there's a couple of very interesting statistics that I'll share. One is that there's a study that estimated if states could get children taken care of, so kids back to school, it would have a larger economic impact than reopening all restaurants and bars. So just think about that, how painful it's been, you know, on the restaurant, bar, entertainment industry, just taking care of childcare with the disproportionate burden on women, because women would be able to go back to their full employment, would far exceed a whole sector coming back online. So there's no question that this could have long-standing impacts. Now, there's some very famous, very interesting labor economics on women over time and men over time, and the differential associated with education. And what we see is some industries, there's really not much of a penalty for dropping out. So the experience for women dropping out is having children. And so if you drop out and you can kind of come back in sort of where you were and proceed, your lifetime earnings isn't, it's only lost that one little bit. But there's actually very few industries that is the case, including healthcare, with the exception of pharmacy. What happens is women cannot come back to their full employment. And so it shifts, it basically takes away a huge return to your education and experience for the rest of your working life. So that's why this economy has to be jump-started quick, fast, to prevent long-standing consequences to women and their families.
Yeah, certainly thinking about things like contributions to retirement and so forth too, that even if you're employed at a relatively low salary, if you're contributing to retirement, you're still saving more than if you were at home. But I don't see any other questions from the audience. I do want to thank you both, including Dr. Zane. I think it's really important, your message, especially for the residents, that there's no crystal ball, but things are probably going to be okay and we will get through this. And I think, as Dr. Libby pointed out very well, that investment in education and training is good, and things are hard, but the investment that you are making now is a good one. I think there's a lot of things to be optimistic about, as well as perhaps clear-eyed about challenges facing us. So as Dr. Zane said, please vote. You still have a few days to get your ballot here in Colorado, or you can go in person. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will put the link on the website. Thank you.
Thank you so much.